So this is my Yamaha XVS 1100. This is the classic Silverado model, 2007, but they're all pretty much the same. And today I'm going to look at stripping down the carburettor, giving it a good clean and a service, replacing the seals and needles, and hopefully getting a better performance. It was struggling on the top end when giving it full gas. So I'm hoping that by cleaning the jets, renewing the seals, etc., and just giving it a good clean, it might improve that top end performance. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to turn the fuel valve on the left hand side here to off, and I'm going to run off the petrol that's in the carburettor system at the moment. Got the rear garage door open just to make sure the fumes don't cause the problems, and I'm just going to let it run all the petrol off. So that's all the petrol run off out of the system. So the first stage is I'm going to take the rear seat off and the front seat off, so I can get access to the petrol tank. So to remove the rear seat, just going to unscrew this bolt here, this nut, and that will release the rear seat. As I go through the process, as much as possible, I'm going to replace bolts and screws and nuts back onto their place settings, so I don't lose sight of where they all belong. So this is now the bolt that secures the front seat, and I'm going to remove that and unclip the front seat next. Just going to replace that bolt. Right, next here we have this electrical connector that needs detaching. There are some plastic securing pins that need removing, and then that will allow us to remove this plastic facing plate, cover plate, and then after that you need to undo these two bolts here, which will enable us to remove the fuel tank. Now, before removing the fuel tank, I do need to disconnect here the actual fuel pipe, and underneath there's also a breather pipe underneath the fuel tank itself that will be need to disconnected before I can then remove the fuel tank itself. So I'm just going to start by pinching this clip here. Now, although we have run off the petrol in the carburettor system, there could be a few drips still left in here. But with the fuel tap switched off, it prevents any fuel running out of the tap there from the tank above. So we'll just leave that sat there for the moment, and we'll now disconnect the breather pipe underneath the fuel tank. There is a little metal circular clip around the head of the breather pipe, which just needs to be released and pulled down further down the pipe before releasing the breather pipe securely. So hopefully you can see there the little metal clip that just needs pressing in and pulling further down the pipe, and then pulling that off the tap outlet on the breather pipe. So I'm now ready to remove the fuel tank. and it's just a matter of pulling it back and moving it from side to side to ease it off the rubber buffers location points at the front of the fuel tank. There we are, so having wiggled it from side to side, making sure the handlebars are out of the way. Got a towel ready here at the back, just so we can put it on a soft surface and avoid any scratching. It does help to run the petrol down in the tank down to the reserve, just to make it lighter. Next I'm going to remove the air filter unit from the right hand side by removing these bolts here on the outer ring of the air filter. As you can see, the air filter is starting to come away from its secure housing. So I just need to undo this last bolt. So those are the two bolts out, but around the back, just here, there's just a plastic pin that goes into a rubber kind of buffer, and that just needs giving quite a strong pull, and then that will release the air filter. There we go. So that was the plastic pin there that came out of this rubber housing. So that's the complete air filter that we can put to one side, and we're now starting to see that we're getting some access to the carburettor itself there between the two cylinders. As always, I'm just going to put these bolts back in their housings on the air filter frame, just so we don't get them mixed up or lost. Likewise with the two bolts that secured the fuel tank. So this is the inlet hose from the air filter, which has a clip ring secured by this screw here. So I'm just going to remove that screw and then start to wiggle and remove this hose then from the top box. So I'm just using a normal Phillips screwdriver to release that screw and slacken the metal clip around that hosing. Shouldn't need to take it fully out, you're just releasing the pressure on the metal clip that's binding the hose onto its housing. Right, so with the metal clip pressure released on the hose housing, little wiggle, and you can see it quite easily comes off. That's the metal clip housing that I was referring to earlier. You can see the cross-hex screw there, and how when turned anti-clockwise it releases the pressure on the metal clip around the rubber hose. There you can see I'm just putting the parts down on the towel as I remove them, making sure that there's no damage and that I don't lose them. So next I'm going to remove this chrome cover on the left hand side of the bike, which is just secured by these two Allen key screws. So with the screws out, just going to remove the chrome cover cap, and there you can see that we're starting on the left hand side now to see the carburettor system better, getting more access to it, but quite a few pipes and leads to remove yet. Just going to put those screws back in. So next I want to be able to remove this airflow box at the top of the bike, and there's another hose underneath here on the left hand side where the metal retaining clip needs to be released. Again, there's just one screw crosshead that just needs releasing the pressure off, and then the hose should be released then from the top airflow box. We now need to remove this bolt here from the back of the airflow box. As you take this one out, just be careful that you don't miss taking out also the metal sleeve that the bolt sits in. And then just by wiggling that box, having previously released that hose in, it should come out pretty easy. Just while I disconnect some of the cables, leads and hoses, just going to put a couple of rags lightly in the top of each air inlet, just to prevent any debris falling in. Again, we don't need to take this screw fully out, just releasing pressure on the metal ring clip. So that's the one on the rear done. And then this is the one on the front that's now released. So I'm going to need both hands now to wiggle these 90-degree hoses and remove them from the engine. So doing the front one first. There we are. Looking to see if there, oh yeah, there is. And that's number one there. That's the second one out. Number two there. I'm just looking there now into the air intake for the carburettor feeding the cylinder at the front, and again you can see some residue there at the front which I don't think should be there, and I'm thinking is excess carburettor cleaner that I've sprayed in the past. That's the rear one, and you can see that's nice, dry and clean. Now this is the choke mechanism here, so if we just move the choke lever on the handlebar, you can see that operating. So I'm going to need to disconnect that cable by releasing the crosshead screw. So it's this screw here that I'm loosening first. And with the screw out, you can see how the pressure is now being released on the choke cable. Yeah. So I'm just going to put this screw back in, as it's part of the carburettor mechanism. these screws on the top of the carburettor are very, very soft metal, so you have to be careful you don't strip the head. So I'm just going to feed this choke cable out of the way now, down the left hand side of the bike. There we are. We need as much room in here as possible for getting the carburettor out once we've disconnected some of the other cables and leads. I'm just going to take this front airflow pipe that goes to the front cylinder off, just to give me a little bit more room within the engine compartment. Metal retaining clip that just needs releasing, and then the pipe should just ease off. There we are. Put that down with the other bits. So I'm on the right hand side of the bike here, and next I'm going to remove this pipe here by slackening this retaining clip and moving it up the tube. So there could be a few drips of petrol there as that pipe comes off, residue that's been left in there. Just removing this top breather pipe now. So initially I was trying to remove this piping by releasing this metal retaining clip on the bottom of the carburettor, but the space I was working in was just too tight. So I've just made it easier for myself, and I've come back up to this junction here and I've loosened the metal retaining clip, that one there, slid it down the pipe, and it was quite tight, but eventually working it with some pliers I was able to remove it. So this is on the left hand side of the bike now, moving away that metal retaining clip on this particular pipe, and then going to have to use a little bit of pressure and force movement from side to side to release it. There it comes. So we'll do that front one first. Yeah, as I thought, easy access, lots to get a grip on, and unscrews easily. So that just moves out the way a little. The second nut to release on the throttle cable mechanism is the one that's underneath the small thin plate bracket. You won't be able to get a spanner onto the top nut, but you can quite easily get a spanner onto the bottom nut, release it, and then the mechanism will come out. There are 4 electrical connectors towards the front of the carburettor which need now detaching. Each of them have a separate style of connector, so it's impossible to reconnect them incorrectly. Right, nearly there now. We've got the rubber hosing connectors, and there is an Allen key screw on each of the metal retaining clips. There's the back one, there's the front one, and there's a little brass sleeve in the middle as well, so make sure you don't lose that as you take it out. So you need to release both those clips as much as possible, but without taking the screws fully out, so that there's no pressure at all on the hoses. And then what we're going to do now, having released those, is that you can see that the carburettor is starting to wiggle and move, and we're going to move it from side to side continually until it comes off those housings. So I've been twisting from side to side and pulling upwards, and you'll feel the pressure against the rubber hosings. You just need to apply the pressure, so as you can see there, it's just, there it is, just come out now. So although it's not free just yet, it is out of the two rubber hosings. So for me, what worked best was wiggle it from side to side and then tipped it down to the bottom left hand side of the bike. So this is now the carburettor coming out of the left hand side of the bike, and it wasn't as difficult as what I thought it would be. There it is. So that's part one over. I'm going to put some rags in those air inlet rubber hose pipings that go into the cylinder, make sure no debris falls in there. That's one. That's two. So we're going to move on to the second stage now, which is going to be a service, a dismantle and rebuild of the carburettor. So what I'm going to do first is that I've covered all the inlets and hose connectors, any opening that's been on the carburettor I've covered up with a bit of cling film, just so I can give it a light spray with some degreaser, just to get the thick off before I start the rebuild. But also on each carburettor there is like a drain plug on the bottom, and I've connected a piece of rubber hosing which I'm going to lead into a glass jar, and I'm just going to drain the petrol off that's in the carburettor, and you can check whether there's any water droplets in there that I've collected in the drain plug area, and also any bits of dirt. So I'm just going to drain each carburettor now through that drain plug. So this is the petrol that I've got out of the carburettor from each of the drain plugs, and by tipping it up one way and then the other, you can get some of the excess fuel in the carburettor to, to kind of flow down into the drain plug holes. So I can't see any water droplets in there, but there are a few black specks of dirt, grease, that I've collected in those drain plug holes. Not visible on the camera necessarily, I can't get it to focus clearly, but there are a few specks in there. So I'm just going to give it a light degrease now.